Bright QT. Every student matters.
So now we look at the spread of feudalism. So we saw the developments taking place and how the feudal order weakens at a particular point in history and how these developments were different mainly in France and England. And the spread of feudalism is now what we see, how it spread to other parts of the world and what its specific features were. So feudalism spread from France to Spain, Italy, and later Germany and Eastern Europe. So the whole of Europe, we could see that feudal structure emerges around the medieval period. The Asian countries also saw the development of feudal institutions. It was not only in Europe, but the Asian countries also saw the development of feudal institutions. In Japan, feudal system was well ordered before the 10th century and it continued with modifications until 19th century. See, for this long the feudal structure continued in Japan. And in other areas such as China, where feudal practices were in existence since the 1100 BC, society became feudalistic but not precisely feudal. So the feudal structure in China was not exactly the way it was in England or in France or in Western Europe, but it still had feudal characteristics. And feudalism in India and Sassanid and Ottoman civilizations was in many ways similar to Western feudalism. So India and in Ottoman civilization also we could see feudal characteristics which had many similarities with that of Europe. But it proved less durable than the feudal system in Europe. But it was less durable or it did not exist for as long as it had existed in England or in France. So one of the questions related to the spread of feudalism is how did feudalism spread to different parts of the world? So this is how you'll have to bring in all the different parts of the world where it had grounded itself or where it had emerged, like Spain, Italy, Germany, and then the Asian continent, and in China, and how in India, and especially in Japan, what all developments it had, and how it continued till the 19th century. And now we come to another important topic within this chapter, that is difference between French and English feudalism. So the feudalism as organized in England was different from European or feudalism in France. So the feudalism in England and its characteristic features were different from how it was practiced or carried out or existed in France. In England, the feudal lords were never allowed to become very powerful. So England, as we saw, it was different because the working of the council, which then later on turned into parliament, and how the king had to take into consideration the requirements or the needs of the people. And in France, such a system didn't exist. The king, to a large extent, turned into an absolute ruler by the late 14th, 15th century. So in England, the feudal lords were never allowed to become very powerful. This is very important. And they were not given complete control over their tenants. In England, unlike France, no feudal lord could use his knights against the king. So important changes were, unlike in France, the feudal lords did not have absolute power over the tenants, and no feudal lord could use his knight or the military men against the king. And in France and in England, the king did not depend upon feudal army alone. He asserted his right to call the national militia or pride at any time. So this is also an important difference which we could see in England. So thus in England, the force of feudalism was limited in every direction. Unlike France, in England, the force of feudalism was limited. And of all the European countries of Middle Ages, England was the least feudalized. So here comes the important characteristic feature which existed in England. The feudal structure was least feudalized in England. So the question which comes in relation to this is, describe the difference between feudalism in England and other European countries. So you'll have to bring the differences which it had with France and how England was least feudalized compared to other countries of Europe. So now we come to the next topic in the chapter, that is historians' views on decline of feudalism. So what are the opinions or suggestions given by different historians on the decline of feudalism? So in the first place, feudalism was a centrifugal force. That is, the king was the king of vassals, not the king of all the people. Each feudal lord was a prince, and the people living in his estate were completely under his control. So here, the position of king is not absolute, but he is in a weaker position because only the tenants in chief were answerable to the king. And those tenants who were under, so the subtenants had to show their allegiance and commitment to their immediate lords than the king. And so it is said, each feudal lord was a prince, and the people living in his estate were completely under his control. Freeman is a scholar, a historian, remarks that while centrally feudalism made the sovereign a landowner, logically landowners became sovereigns. So this is a statement which Freeman says when he discusses the decline of feudalism, which says, while centrally feudalism made the sovereign, that is the king, a landowner, logically landowners became sovereigns. So if you were a tenant, you were also a lord. So the powers of the king was now getting divided among a lot of lords and sublords. Secondly, in the ideal feudal system, where the knights were to be loyal to the immediate lords, there was a great possibility of revolts of the feudal lords. So the revolt of feudal lord was always a possibility. A few landlords could bring trouble for the king by asking their knights to follow them and fight against the king. So this possibility of revolt and the landlords coming in opposition to the king was always a threat to the whole structure. And the third reason historians give as a reason for decline of feudalism is, so the third reason for the decline of feudalism was the defect within the system. So what was this defect? That it gave judicial powers to the lords, that is the feudal lords, and each lord acted as a judge for his tenants because he had all the judicial powers over his tenants. And we know for judges it is essential that they are impartial and should also possess high legal qualification or knowledge of law. But in the case of feudal lords, they never met this expectation, and many times it was difficult for the feudal lords to act impartially because they always gave importance to their own interests than the interests of the tenants. So this was considered as one of the reasons for the decline of feudalism and a major defect in the feudal structure. And then comes the fourth issue, that is merit or ability. So it was not on the basis of merit that public officers were selected. Instead, on the basis of the relationship a person had with the lords, that his position in the society or in the official structure was decided. So more than merit, it was the personal relationship of the person that decided in which kind of job he was taken into. And the position of the serfs here interestingly are also called villains. So this term villain, which we use it today, is always in a negative manner. A villain is somebody who is having a very rowdy like character and cruel in nature, somebody who is having very bad qualities. But in the earlier times, especially in the medieval time, during the feudal period, this was one of the names which were used for cultivators or the laboring class or the serfs. And it is only later that it develops a negative connotation. The reason for this was because this name was used to refer to people belonging to the lowest strata of society. This word itself uh, developed a very negative connotation at a later period. And that is why when we use the term villain today, we use it in a negative sense. So we see that the position of serfs or villains under the feudal system was very deplorable. Yeah, they were oppressed and they were in a very miserable state. And they were bound to the soil. They could not get justice from the royal courts. So they had to be bound to the soil and overwork to help the lords gain more profit. So as a result, it was difficult for the peasants or the serfs to expect justice from the royal feudal lords because they always gave importance to their own interests than the interests of the peasantry. And the last reason is that the chief object of the feudal system was to maintain a large army without actually keeping a standing army. And we already saw it. This was the reason why the kings always depended on the tenants in chief for supply of knights and military service. So the military organization of the feudal system was full of defects because of this absence of a national or a standing army. And the king had to depend on different lords and feudal chiefs to serve the military needs of the kingdom. And the knights were to fight for 40 days in a year, and if the king needed soldiers beyond that time, several difficulties arose. So as per the contract which the knights and the feudal lords had with the king, it was only for 40 days that the knights had to provide service to the king. And in all other days, the knights were supposed to serve the military needs of his immediate lord. So this was also a major defect in the system, which weakened the feudal structure consequently. The knights always showed more loyalty to their immediate lord than to the king. So this also is a major reason for the decline of the feudal structure because knights were always more loyal to their immediate lord than the king, which weakened the position of the king and threatened his power and control. And this further weakened the military system of the country. So as a result of all the specific features, the military system of the country was weak. Now we come to the last topic in the chapter, which is decline of feudalism. We just saw some of the reasons which are leading to the decline of the feudal structure, and we now look at the decline of feudalism. So the feudal system remained the basis of society from 11th to 15th century. Although the signs of decline can be seen, but still the feudal structure remains the basis of the society between 11th to 15th centuries. In England and in many other countries even up to 19th century. So in England by 15th century there is a decline of feudalism, but in many other parts of the world we see that the feudal structure continue for a long time, and in certain parts it continues till the 19th century. The rise of powerful monarchies in France, Spain and England broke down the local organization. So we saw the rise of absolute leaders by the 15th century, or absolute kings, and what all its consequences are. Another disruptive force was the development of means of communication, which broke down the isolated manner, assisted the rise of towns, and facilitated the emergence of bourgeois class. So when we were looking at the reasons for the decline, we saw several economic and agricultural developments happening since the 11th and 12th century. So it included development of means of communication, and as a result the manorial estates where the feudal lords lived with his serfs was not an isolated unit, but now because of the advancements in means of communication, the serfs could now communicate well with people outside of those manorial estates. And another important development was rise of towns. We saw how rise of towns gave the serfs an alternative, that whoever were tired of overworking in the fields of their lords could now escape to the towns and search for new kind of occupation in the towns. And the rise of towns also gave birth to a new section within the society who were called the bourgeoisie, or the middle class. So the middle class were the ones who were involved in large scale trade, and by the 13th and 14th century we see that bourgeoisies become more powerful and replace, or but because of their rise in power, the authority which the nobles enjoyed till then becomes diminished or weakened by the 14th century. Another important developments were the Black Death and the peasant revolts, which destroyed the socio-economic basis of feudal system. So we saw in the 14th century how rats infested ships come to Europe, and which lead to a large-scale death of people all over Europe. And as a result, the labor class also declines, and which gives the laborers a high bargaining power, and they ask for more wages since the 14th century. So as a result, we see that the villain, or the serfs, or the cultivators began to demand cash wages instead of protection of the feudal lord or other kind of return in kind. They asked for cash wages since as the development of all these changes, and they refused to stick to the land of the lord. So if they were not paid what they were asking for, the laborers refused to work on the land of the lord anymore. So with this we come to the end of the chapter. So we saw the factors leading to the rise of a feudal structure, what the important factors were, and then we saw what the term feudalism meant, and then we saw how feudal structure is organized, and that too in a pyramidic form. Why do we call it a pyramid? And then we saw the particular features individually in France and England, how the developments in England was different from other parts of Europe. And then we saw the changes which was happening from the 11th century, and by 14th century what all new developments happen which result in the final decline of the feudal order. So there are some questions related to what we have been discussing. So describe the course of decline of feudalism. So we saw what its course was. We saw that 11th to 15th century the feudal order gets weakened. One of the reasons is the rise of powerful monarchs who then start maintaining a standing army. So the powerful monarch and their rise to power is an important reason for the decline of feudal structure, because the monarchs are no more dependent on their tenants in chief or the knights for military service, but they now have a standing army who are paid in wages than in the form of land. And the other developments were improvement in the means of communication, and the rise of towns was very important development, which leads to the rise of an important category called the bourgeoisie, who are also called an order, which is the fourth order. So till then we just have three orders, and by the time of rise of cities we see a new class emerging who become all the more powerful. And we also saw the reasons included Black Death. The ships infested with rats bring plague to Europe, leading to the death of a lot of Europeans in this period. And as a result, it leads to peasant revolts and their demand for more wages, which contributes to the weakening of feudal structure and its decline at a later stage. So which two events destroyed the socio-economic basis of feudalism? So we see that by 14th century, the economic expansion of Europe slowed down due to various reasons. So between 11th and 14th century, we see there is a large-scale growth of trade and manufacture and economic expansion happening. But by 14th century, there is a crisis and slowing down, and decline in agricultural prices and increase in wages of the laborers hit the income of landlords badly. So by this time the landlords are in a weak position because there are peasant revolts and they are asking for more wages. The landlords desperately tried to give up money contracts they had entered into and revived labor services. So they are trying hard to come into some kind of negotiations with the labor class. But the rebellions of the laborers were severely crushed, and the intensity of the peasant opposition ensured that old feudal relations could not be imposed again. So when the feudal lords tried to force the laboring class to work on their fields as they used to do before, the peasants revolted very violently. And many times these revolts were suppressed by the lords because the lords were very powerful and influential. But still, it was difficult to go back to the old order. And somewhere the lords had to accept the demands which the peasants were making. So all these developments destroyed the socio-economic basis of feudalism, which had flourished mainly between the 9th and the 14th century. So there is another topic which is on the significance of feudal system. Here we look at what the significance of this order was, why it existed in Europe and it spread to other parts of the world in the medieval period, what its important significance or why people continued to be in this uh, social structure for a long period. So it was the convenient method of governing the kingdoms in the medieval days. So one of the reasons was it was a convenient method because collection of revenue, maintenance of standing army, and centralized system of justice were considered as very burdensome duties by the rulers. So if there was no division of power among tenant-in-chiefs and the sublords, the whole responsibility of collecting revenue, maintaining army, and centralized system of justice would have fallen on the king. The king would have had to take complete authority and control of all these affairs of the state, and it would not have been a very easy task to do. So it was convenient that if the division of power happened, the king could give certain responsibilities to the tenant-in-chiefs, who could then assign those below him to carry out those responsibilities. So these made the whole affair a convenient one for the kings and the nobles. The system satisfied the vanity of big landlords in those days. So vanity is false pride. So in some way, this whole feudal structure satisfied the false pride and vanity of the big landlords because it made each noble think that he is a miniature king or a small king because he had great powers in his hand. And feudalism, to a large extent, made the noble think that he is a miniature king and he had his own palace and other facilities which made him think so. And the means of transportation and communication were primitive. So in this time when feudalism is flourishing, the truth was that the transportation and communication facilities were very limited because of lack of advancements in technology. And there was no political consciousness among masses. Along with this, the masses or the common people were also not aware of their rights and what kind of political structure they benefited them. So this was also a major thing which was absent in this period, especially between 9th to 13th century. And under these circumstances, this rough and ready system of giving land to the feudal lords and asking them to maintain law and order within their areas was found to be most convenient. So again, we are going back to the factor that is convenience. So because of lack of proper communication and technology, it was difficult for the king to kind of carry out all these affairs by himself, and therefore he regarded this division of power among lords and sublords as a convenient option to carry out certain responsibilities. So that's why the whole feudal structure was significant and it existed in Europe and in other parts of the world for a long time. And we have one last question from the book, that is, who were knights and when did they become a separate group and when did they decline? So we have already looked at it. So we see that there were frequent localized wars in Europe from the 9th century. We saw already that after the death of Charlemagne the Great, there are attacks on the Frankish Empire and the collapse of the central structure, and there are a lot of battles and wars happening on a frequent basis. And the untrained peasant soldiers were not sufficient. So by this time, the kings and the tenants understand that the untrained peasants were not sufficient, and there was a need of good cavalry, that is, trained soldiers were needed. This increased the importance of new section of people, the knights. So as a result, the knights emerged who were trained soldiers. The lord gave the knight a piece of land called fief and promised to protect it. So, as a return for the military services which the knight gave, the lord gave him protection and the protection of the fief which was given to the knight. And the fief had an area between 1000 to 2000 acres. So we see that it was a large area which was given to the knight as a return to the military services which he was providing the chief. And the chief object of feudal system was to maintain a large army without actually keeping a large standing army. This is also something we have already seen. The preference of the feudal structure was to keep a large army without having a standing army permanently. And the knights were to fight for 40 days, and if the king needed soldiers beyond that time, difficulties arose. So we also saw that the contract between the knights and kings were such that they had to give 40-day service in a year to the main king, and in other times the knights were supposed to serve their immediate lords. So this gave rise to a lot of problem at a later stage, and the knights always showed more loyalty to their immediate lord than to the king. So this was the major problem. They were more affiliated or were more committed to the immediate lord than to the supreme king. This further weakened the military system of the country, leading to the decline of the position of knights. So as a result, by 14th century, the position of knight declined and the whole military system also weakens because of the defects which it had within the system. So with this, we come to the end of the chapter, that is your chapter 9, which is three orders. And in this chapter, we have already looked at whom these three orders were, and we know it is the clergy, that is the priests, and the nobility, that is the aristocracy, and came the peasants or the cultivators. How they became the three different stratas within the feudal order. And we also saw the factors leading to feudalism, the meaning of the term feudalism, and the organization of feudalism in a pyramidical form. And then we also saw how feudalism in France was different from the developments which happened in England in the medieval period. And then with time period, we have already looked at in the initial part of the chapter, we see the developments between 9th and 11th century. That is the period when feudalism as a structure develops, the initial period. And from around 11th to 14th century, we see many other developments taking place and the flourishing of the feudal structure. So there is expansion of agriculture, expansion in trade, and other activities taking place. And by the 14th century, the trade activities flourish and there is emergence of a new class who are called the merchant class, who become the fourth order. And then we see that with this, the whole structure of the feudal order starts weakening because of the rise of new class and coming up of the merchants or the bourgeois class. And then by the 14th century, there are several changes taking place, like the rise of new monarchs who are not anymore dependent on their knights or the tenant-in-chief, but they have a strong standing army. And by this time, technological developments are taking place, rise of towns are happening, new classes are emerging, and as a result, several socio-economic changes happen. And in the 14th century, another important development which takes place is the bubonic plague. That is, the ships which were infested with rats come to Europe, leading to a death of a lot of people in Europe, and as a result, the number of the laboring class also goes down, which help them ask for more wages. So when the peasants ask for more wages and have revolts in different places, it weakens the position of the landlords, and it becomes very difficult for the landlords to keep the peasants tied down to their fields, because now the peasants have other options like going off to the towns. So as a result, the whole feudal order declines, weakens, and comes to an end by the 15th century. But still, there are places in and around the world where the feudal structure, in some way or the other, continued for a long time too. So, in Crux, this is what we have closely looked at in chapter 9. I hope you enjoyed this tracing of these changes over this long centuries, and we'll continue with the other chapters which deals with the further progress happening in history, mainly in the European continent.